The army came at dawn, and it came like a tide. Not a column, not the neat disciplined march of a patrol or an inspection force. A tide, the way water moves when there is simply too much of it to be stopped by the shape of the land. They filled the valley road, and then spilled off it, rank after rank pressing forward through the pine scrub and the frost-pale grass, banners catching the first gray light. I had seen their advance scouts 2 days before, and done the arithmetic. The arithmetic had not been encouraging. Wol-yeong stood at the parapet above the eastern gate, watching them come. She was very still. The defenders around her were not, hands white-knuckled on crossbow stocks, breath coming in visible puffs in the cold air, someone's foot shifting and shifting again on the stone. She let them fidget. She waited until the leading ranks were close enough that she could read the formation, close enough that a shot would carry true, and then she turned to face the wall. "They've come to make us a lesson," she said. Her voice was level. "Then let's give them a lesson instead. Hold your fire for the range." Among the Empire's officers, at the edge of the command pavilion, Ryu Gyeom stood apart from the generals and said nothing. He had been saying nothing for most of the campaign. The generals had stopped expecting him to speak. He was a court inspector, a man of records and measurements, and what use was a man of records when the business at hand was siege engines and numbers of dead? They had stopped looking at him. That suited him. It meant no one saw his face when the mage-corps took their positions and began to channel. He watched them work. He watched the mandate answer, or try to answer. The old power moved through the corps like water through a cracked vessel, arriving thin and wrong. The light it produced pale and unconvincing at the edges. At siege scale, with 100 channelers drawing at once, the failure was not subtle. It guttered, it spat. 2 of the junior mages simply sat down in the mud, drained to nothing in moments, and the senior corps master looked at Ryu Gyeom across the pavilion, with an expression that asked a question Ryu Gyeom did not want to answer. "We are not besieging a town," he thought. "We are besieging the future, and it does not run out of cannon." He had written that in a report. The report had been filed. He did not know if anyone had read it. The corps master raised his hands again, and the mandate flickered and held, barely, the way a lamp holds when the oil is nearly gone. Ryu Gyeom looked at the failing light and thought of all the things he had measured and certified and recorded, all the standards he had carried from the capital to the frontier, and he thought, there is nothing left in it. We are a corpse swinging a sword out of habit. He did not say this aloud. There was no one to say it to. Iron Ridge answered. The cannon were spaced along the wall at intervals that Do-jin had calculated and Wol-yeong had approved, sighted for overlapping fields, and positioned so that the crews could serve them without crowding. They were not beautiful weapons. They were squat, dark, practical things, their bores true because the boring mill had made them true, their touch holes clean because Mok Jae had spent 3 days teaching the crews how to clean them. They had been proof-fired. They had been measured. The crews knew their charges and their ranges because they had drilled the charges and the ranges until the knowledge lived in the body rather than the mind. Wol-yeong watched the tide advance. She waited. Then, "They've brought enough men to drown us if we waste a shot. Fire!" The wall shook, not with magic, with physics, with powder and iron, and the brute fact of a true bore driving a true ball on a true line. The volley was not simultaneous, which was correct. A simultaneous volley from a wall of cannon produces a single moment of chaos and then a long silence while everyone reloads. These were staggered. By the time the last gun on the east wall fired, the first gun's crew was already swabbing and measuring the next charge. The sound was continuous. The Empire's front ranks did not find a gap in it. I watched from the interior of the wall, where I had no business being except that Wol-yeong had told me to stay close, and I had not argued. I watched the volleys, and I watched the crews, and I thought, this is what a true bore looks like at range. This is what the boring mill was for. The satisfaction was not clean. There were men dying in the valley, but it was there, the way the satisfaction of a well-made thing is always there underneath whatever else you feel about it. Do-gwang was everywhere at once, which was his gift. He had been safety master long enough that the town knew his voice the way it knew the sound of the forge, a constant, present thing, the sound of someone paying attention so that you could afford to pay attention to your own work. Now he moved along the wall and through the streets behind it, finding the places where fear was tipping toward collapse and arriving before it tipped all the way. The defenders were not soldiers, they were the people who had built this place, the refugees who had come through the eastern pass with nothing and been given work and a bed, the orphans from Unha's workshop who had grown up knowing how to measure and fit and finish, the old Iron Ridge families who remembered when the veil was strong and the ore ran easy, the men and women who had lost hands or eyes or the full use of a leg in the forge and the mill, and who were here anyway, serving powder or carrying water or holding a position because it was their wall and they had helped build it. Do moved among them, and he did not offer them comfort exactly, he offered them the thing they had already done. You are the people who built this, he said, and his voice carried the way voices carry when they mean what they say, and nobody takes what you built. Pour it back into them. They held, that is the plain fact of it, they held. But holding is not winning. I knew that. Wol-yeong knew that. Every person on that wall who had done any arithmetic at all knew that. The empire had come with enough men to absorb what we could do to them and still have men left. They had siege engineers who had done this before, who knew how walls failed and where to push. They had supply lines that stretched back to a capital that did not know what it meant to run short of anything. We had a factory and a veil that was failing and a town full of people who were fighting because they had nowhere else to go. Holding isn't winning, I thought, watching the valley fill with the empire's campfires as the first day wore on. Courage buys time. It doesn't buy a war. There has to be something we have that they don't. I did not have the answer yet. I kept looking for it. The breach came at mid-morning of the second day. The siege engines had been working the east wall since before dawn, not the mandate-powered constructions the empire had relied on in previous campaigns, but heavy timber machines, counterweighted and crewed by teams of men who understood leverage and did not need magic to understand it. The wall there was old stone, older than the forge, older than Do-jin's arrival, and it had been repaired in places with newer work that did not quite match the original. The siege engineers had found the seam. Of course they had. That is what siege engineers are for. The crack ran up the wall in a line that was almost geometrically clean, and then a section of the parapet came down, and then the section below it, and the breach was opened. Wol-yeong's voice cut through the noise from somewhere I couldn't see. Breach on the east wall. All reserves. Plug it now, or they're inside the town. The reserves moved. They were not fast enough, and there were not enough of them, and the first wave of Empire soldiers came through the gap before the defenders could close it, and for a moment the east quarter of Iron Ridge was a very bad place to be. I saw what happened at the breach later, in pieces from people who had been there. Mok Jae had been running powder to the east wall guns when the section came down. He was 17 years old, and he had been my apprentice long enough to know how to measure a bore, and fit a coupling, and calculate a gear ratio, and none of that knowledge was useful to him in the moment the breach opened and the Empire's soldiers came through it. What was useful to him was that he had grown up in Iron Ridge, and the people around him had grown up in Iron Ridge, and they were all, in that moment, defending the same thing. Old Sok was at the breach. He had been one of the voices against the refugees in the early days. Not a cruel man, not a stupid man, but a man who had lived his whole life in a place that was his and had found the arrival of so many people who needed things frightening in the way that scarcity is always frightening. He had argued loudly. He had been wrong, and he had been told he was wrong, and he had spent the months since in the particular silence of a man who is reconsidering something he held for a long time. He was at the breach with a pike, and Mok Jae was at his left, and the Empire's soldiers were coming through. "Sok, I've got your left," Mok shouted. "Don't you dare go down, old man." "Mind your own flank, boy," Sok said, and then, a beat later, something different in his voice. "Good lad, push them back." They pushed them back. The breach held. It held because Suk covered the gap on the right side and kept it covered until the reserves arrived, and he was still covering it when the arrow found him, and he went down slowly, the way a man goes down when he has decided not to go down and his body has overruled him. One of the refugee women, she had come through the eastern pass 2 winters ago, with 3 children and the clothes they stood in, knelt beside him while the fighting was still loud at the edges of the breach. She had been carrying water for the defenders. She set down her bucket. "He called us beggars once," she said, "to no one in particular, to everyone. He died so my babies could live. We'll not forget him." Mok Jae stood at the edge of the sealed breach and looked at Sok, and looked at the refugee woman, and looked at the people around him, the old families, and the newcomers, and the orphans, and the maimed, all of them breathing hard, all of them marked by the same fight, and he thought something that he told me later, quietly, in the way he tells me things he has worked out and is not sure he has the right words for. "There's no them. There was never any them. There's just us, holding the wall." He was right. That is the plain fact of that too. Night came, and the Empire's fires filled the valley like a second town, larger than ours, patient in the way that large things are patient. We had held the wall. We had held the breach. We had paid for both in blood, and the Empire had paid in blood, and the Empire had more blood to spend than we did, and everyone on both sides of the wall knew it. Wol-yeong stood at the parapet in the dark, and looked at the fires and said what needed to be said. "They've got 30 more days in them. Holding isn't going to be enough." She was not asking me for an answer. She was stating a condition, the way an engineer states a constraint. Here is the boundary, now work within it. I had spent the day looking for the answer, and I thought I had found the edge of it, the place where it began. "They brought an army," I said. "We brought a factory. Tomorrow we stop trying to outfight them. We outlast them." The fires burned in the valley. The veil overhead was pale and thin, barely visible against the stars, the old mandate guttering down to almost nothing. Below it, in the forge-lit streets of Iron Ridge, the machinery was still running, the bellows turning, the mill wheel moving, the tools that we had built to build other tools waiting in the dark for morning. An army runs on what it carries runs out. A factory runs on what it makes.